Okay, and is it recording right now?
How you doing, John? I'm good. Good.
Well,
you feeling better?
Should she stop?
Thank you for asking.
She's great.
Not doing great, but she's 80 something.
Yeah, my mom's
Yeah.
Jim.
doing all that with her.
Be careful what you say. We're
Yeah, my
recording.
mom has that too.
Can you say anything about this?
She's got some ailments from her falls and stuff that her shoulder won't heal. But it's a process.
Yeah.
But she'll look at me and go, why does my arm hurt?
Yeah, my arm's already tired. Yeah, my mom did that too. I was like, because I punched you.
Welcome to the 2020 Extreme History Lecture Series. Woo! We're so excited to be here again this year. We've been doing this lecture series for about 6 or 7 years, and it's so wonderful to be in this space for another year doing this lecture series. We are so thankful to the Museum of the Rockies for letting us use this space and for hosting this lecture series for us in this beautiful hangar auditorium. So a big thanks to the Museum of the Rockies for that. So my name is Crystal Alegria, and I am the director of the Extreme History Project, and we are the organization that puts on this lecture series. And for those of you who don't know, the Extreme History Project is a local nonprofit, and our mission is to make history relevant. And that's what we're doing tonight. We are making history relevant. Yeah. Yes. So we do that in a lot of different ways. This lecture series is one of the ways we do that. We do historic walking tours during the summer, getting people on places where history happened. We also do workshops, we do some powerful programming, and we have some really powerful programming that we're going to be working on in 2020 and 2021. So if you haven't signed up on our sign-up sheet, our email list, make sure to do that. We have a list out in the front. You can sign up on your way out. If you would like to be on our Facebook page, we encourage you to like the Extreme History Project Facebook page. We put out some really relevant and important information on that page as well. So if you haven't liked us, like us, that would be great. I would like to really quickly say a couple thank yous. Thank you again to the Museum of the Rockies for hosting this lecture series. I'd also like to thank KGBM, which is a local radio station, and they come and record these lectures every time we do them. They record a lot of other lectures and presentations throughout the community of Bozeman. And then they put those on 95.5 FM. And so those lectures and presentations are run again and again so that the community listening to that can hear these lectures. So it's a really important service, and it's all volunteer run, and it's a great organization. So we just wanted to give them a big thanks for that. And Steve is up in the booth. I also wanted to thank all of you for donating to our end-of-year appeal for the Extreme History Project. We could not do this work without all of you. Literally all of you sitting in the seats right there, that is who funds the Extreme History Project. And so we could not do this work without you. We were totally grassroots. So thank all of you for sending in your checks for the end-of-year appeal. If you wanted to and didn't get around to it, we will still take your money. So, so drop a check on the way out, or send us one. We have some little membership cards that you can pick up on the way out if you'd like to do that as well. Become a member of the Historical Activist League. And our membership program isn't just a membership program where you send in $25 and you get a t-shirt. We actually encourage you to become part of our Historical Activist League and join with us and do this work that we do. So that's why we call it the Historical Activist League. So hopefully you can do that. Now I'm so excited to have Andi with us here tonight. I love to have students, PhD students, come in and talk about their research. It's really that connection between Montana State University and the community. And so we're so excited to have Andi here with us tonight. And Andi Powers was born and raised right here in Montana. She has a master's degree in English from the University of Alaska, as well as a graduate certificate in Native American Studies from Montana State University. She has a decade of experience teaching at the university level. Andi is currently a PhD candidate in American Studies at Montana State University, and her recent research focuses on performances of race, including redface and blackface in the West. So please join me in welcoming Andi Powers.
Thanks for that lovely introduction. And thanks to Crystal and Nancy and the Extreme History Project for all their help, and including me, and allowing me to kick off this year's series of lectures. What I will be sharing tonight is based in part on my dissertation, and it is still a work in progress, and I'm terribly nervous, so please bear with me. I would like to offer a warning that some of the language, images, and events discussed tonight are disturbing, including graphic violence. So I'd like to begin with the help from some words from the African-American writer and activist James Baldwin. Quote, "From a very literal point of view, the harbors, the ports, and the railroads of the country, the economy, could not conceivably be what they are if it had not been, and this is still so, for cheap labor. I am speaking very seriously, and this is not an overstatement. I picked the cotton. I carried it to the market. I built the railroads under someone else's whip for nothing. Nothing. This in the land of the free, the home of the brave. None can challenge that statement. It is a matter of historical record," end quote. The story of Empire is about a community pursuing the American dream, a particularly Western version of that dream with the desire to own and live off the land. And the American West is often portrayed as a place that lacked the racism and discrimination prevalent in other parts of the country. Wyoming specifically holds the title of the Equality State. However, research indicates African Americans in the West were met with many of the same racist attitudes and behaviors they faced elsewhere. My research focuses on how racism and violence contributed to the short life of the African American community of Empire. For me, the history of the dehumanization of Black peoples and the legacy of slavery in the United States is an integral part of the stories of African Americans in the West. Although the African American population in Wyoming remained small during the 19th and early 20th centuries, anti-Black sentiment was still deeply ingrained in local cultures. African Americans made up only 1.5% of the population of Wyoming in 1890, and by 1910, this would drop to just a fraction of a percent. Black troops with the 9th Cavalry arrived in Wyoming in 1885. They encountered racism and discrimination, including in local press coverage. The next year, in 1886, 6 Black men and women trying to vote in South Pass, Wyoming, were stopped by an angry mob. Ultimately, the group was able to vote, but only when an armed U.S. Marshal escorted them to the polls. And this was indicative of some of the social climate in the decades prior to the establishment of Empire, Wyoming. Empire was a short-lived African-American homesteading community in eastern Wyoming from about 1908 to 1920. The town was primarily settled by members of 2 extended families, the Species and the Tailors. Both families came to Wyoming by way of Nebraska, and it is almost certain that each family had parents and or grandparents who were born enslaved. The census for the area in 1910 listed 36 Black residents. Soon after that census, the settlement's population would exceed 50 citizens. Empire began to take shape in the spring of 1908, when brothers Charles, Joseph, and John Speece filed for homesteads around the Spoon Hill Creek area in eastern Wyoming. Rosetta, just 17 at the time, accompanied her husband Charles. Charles and Rosetta would have 17 children.
Never heard of that.
And here in this picture, she's just 16, and this is a picture from their wedding day.
Single-handedly
The couple were no strangers to the exoduster movement of African Americans migrating out of the South into Kansas, Oklahoma, and other areas to set up Black communities. Rosetta's father, Charles Meehan, a white Irishman, had helped establish an African American community in Overton, Nebraska in 1885, and again in DeWitt in 1910. Charles Speece's father, Moses Speece, along with brothers Jerry Shore and Henry Webb, were early homesteaders in Custer County, Nebraska. All three brothers were former slaves. You may have noticed that each had a different last name, and that's because they had no family name of their own, and each held the name of their former slave masters. This area of Wyoming was experiencing an increase in homesteaders as the result of the new government irrigation canal. At the same time, the state as a whole was seeing an upsurge in small farms. According to one historian, the Speece brothers intended to establish, quote, an independent and self-sufficient community for African American homesteaders, end quote. Soon after the Speece siblings acquired their homesteads, they were joined by brothers Otis and Basement Taylor, and we'll learn a little bit more about Basement later. By the summer of 1908, several members of the Speece and Taylor families were settled in what would soon come to be known as Empire. The town was likely named after the investment company that enticed the group to homestead in the area. The Torrington Telegram announced the arrival of the new homesteaders and reassured the surrounding community that, quote, they are colored people, but are the sort who make good citizens, end quote. A short year later, in 1909, Empire had set up its own school with an African American teacher of their choosing. At least one non-Black family would send their children to the school for a short period, while the other white families in the area outright refused to send their children to a school with a Black teacher. In 1911, the county school board in Torrington dismissed the teacher chosen by Empire and replaced her with a white teacher. The community protested, and eventually the original teacher was allowed back. Empire resident Russell Taylor, who's pictured here, later explained, quote, that in all his years in school, no white teacher or school book had ever taught anything about, indeed were ignorant of, the accomplishments of Blacks and their roles in history, end quote. By 1912, the school had 22 students and was headed by Russell Taylor, who had a bachelor's degree as well as a divinity degree and was an ordained Presbyterian minister. But Russell Taylor was not the only highly educated member of the community. John Speece had multiple degrees in practice law. Radford Speece also attended college. Theodosia Scroggins served the community as a midwife. And while very much an agricultural community, the residents of Empire made livings in a multitude of ways. Many worked in nearby communities. Basement Taylor and Edna Speece both worked at hotels in Torrington, and Florence Speece worked as a cook and domestic servant in Fort Laramie. Miles Speece, son of Joseph and Lizzie, started drilling wells while still in his teens and found much success with the self-made business. However, despite the community's successes, its residents experienced challenges as well. Including local harassment. In February of 1911, the Buffalo Bulletin and several other publications reported that Charles Speece had been arrested and charged with, quote, cattle stealing, but had been out on bond when he failed to appear at a hearing in Torrington. The record is sparse, but after forfeiting his bond, Speece's case was transferred to Cheyenne, and the charges were probably dropped soon thereafter. The specifics remain unclear, but it is possible that these charges stemmed from local harassment. An accusation of cattle rustling could be a dangerous one. It would be just a few years later that Charles and Rosetta Speece and their children would move back to Nebraska. For several years, it seemed that Empire might just succeed. Between 1912 and 1915, Joseph Speece was mentioned in local newspapers for his achievements in farming and raising hogs, in several cases winning awards for his produce at local fairs. A 1913 Cheyenne Daily Leader article about Empire declared, quote, "Colored colony most prosperous," end quote. The story prominently featured Russell Taylor, quote, "the efficient and educated pastor and schoolmaster of the colored colony," end quote, and the article noted that all those who were qualified to file for homesteads had done so, and others had already proved up their land. Many of the residents were previously experienced with dryland farming in Nebraska, and quote, "all are satisfied with their new homes and the colony wears an unusual air of prosperity," end quote. So it does appear that, at least briefly, the fantasy of owning and living off the land seemed within reach for the residents of Empire. However, within 7 years from this article, the community would go into drastic decline and then disappear entirely. There are many reasons that Empire failed as a community, including drought and the post-war economy. However, racism and violence also had an effect on the settlement. One way that racist ideas about African Americans were spread in the United States was through Blackface Entertainment. For over 100 years, these performances demeaned Black peoples for the entertainment of crowds across the country. Blackface Entertainment in the US was primarily performed by white actors for predominantly white audiences. And Blackface minstrelsy is considered to be one of the first uniquely American forms of entertainment. Stage performances usually consisted of actors wearing grease paint or burnt cork on their faces and wearing oversized or ragged, quote, Negro costumes. The shows usually included a mix of comedy, music, dancing, and oration. The scholar Eric Law ultimately sees blackface performances as propping up the fantasy of white supremacy in American culture. Quote, "Black figures were there to be looked at, shaped to the demands of desire. They were screens on which audience fantasy could rest. And while this purpose might have had a host of different effects, its fundamental outcome was to secure the position of white spectators as superior, controlling figures," end quote. So here's a small sample of entertainers who have worn blackface. And I include this slide not to ruin your favorite entertainers for you, but just to point out how common the practice has been and the range of those who have performed in blackface. For example, it united such disparate personalities as Roddy Ragged Piper, the professional wrestler, and Sir Laurence Olivier, the much revered British actor. And some of these performances were, within the last 10 years as well. One historian claims that Blackface Entertainment in Nebraska influenced the decision of the Species and Tailors to relocate to Wyoming. However, moving to Wyoming would not allow the Species Tailors or other Black residents to escape the racism that they experienced elsewhere. Wyoming regularly hosted Blackface Entertainment during this period. Everywhere it seems, the nightmare of white supremacy and racism punctured the fantasy of the American dream for those considered other. Blackface Entertainment's reign in Wyoming dated from roughly the late 1880s to the late 1940s, with the most popular period being the first few decades of the 20th century, which coincides with the life of the town of Empire. Blackface performances in Wyoming were advertised and lauded in local newspapers such as the Bighorn Sentinel and the Cheyenne Daily Leader. They included both amateur performers and professional shows on tour. Blackface spread negative views and stereotypes of Black peoples throughout the United States, and in places with small Black populations, such as Wyoming, these stereotypes might be the only exposure to Black peoples that residents experienced. Just before Christmas in 1912, the Torrington Telegram announced that local Boy Scouts had put on a blackface performance in the little town of Wyncote, just a few miles west of Empire. The paper stated, quote, "The Boy Scouts of Torrington gave a Negro dialect at Wyncote Schoolhouse last Thursday night, and we can't get through smiling," end quote. In 1916, high schoolers in Sheridan put on a show that included one of the teachers performing blackface, who, quote, "made a decidedly hit," end quote. The event was put on for an organization of local businesses and held at the local church. Similarly, high school seniors in Kermerer put on a blackface sketch as part of a high school dance in the summer of 1918, with extra proceeds going to the Red Cross. Pictured here is the Atlas Theater in Cheyenne, which regularly hosted blackface performances, and circled in red is the balcony where African Americans were segregated at the theater until the late 1950s. Blackface performances were held in the larger towns of Cheyenne, Laramie, and Sheridan, as well as smaller, more rural areas. In 1885, Haverly's Great Minstrel Company visited Cheyenne. The Cheyenne Daily Sun reported that, quote, the best of blackface people are in the company, end quote. 2 decades later, the taste for such entertainment had not lost its allure. In 1905, Fred Frink performed as F, quote, the sleepy son of Africa, end quote, as part of a vaudeville show that was called, quote, a tremendous hit by the Wyoming Tribune. Interestingly, the review of this show ran alongside a local news article entitled, Was Justified? It reported a Union Pacific watchman was determined by the courts to be acting in self-defense when he shot a, quote, Negro trespasser, end quote, to death in the railroad yard. The paper noted that the murdered man allegedly had a piece of paper indicating he had previously served time at San Quentin Prison for burglary. It was evidence, the article suggested, that surely reinforced that the man's murder was justified. Vaudeville and similar performances often included acts on display for their exoticism and novelty. In 1908, in Sheridan, the Hennessy brothers performed blackface as part of a menagerie, which also included, quote, a troupe of a dozen Japanese who turned themselves inside out with one hand and juggled 9 balls with the other, end quote. In 1918, the Hippodrome Vaudeville featured a blackface duo alongside an animal act featuring several dogs and a monkey. The Atlas hosted performances by, quote, the Oris, an unrivaled trio consisting of 2 expert blackface comedians and a performing dog in the Clever Kid Comical Coon Act with their cute canine Curly, end quote. That same year, Mirth and Melody performed at the theater. The local paper raved, Melody, quote, offers a novelty on roller skates and is a rare type of chap who comes close to breaking his neck for the entertainment of the Cheyenne folks, end quote. Other performers on display included Little Carl, quote, the world's most wonderful Indian boy, end quote. And he's pictured here. In October of 1907, Laramie was getting ready for the annual Elks Minstrel Show. It featured locals as well as professional blackface actor Dr. A.B. Hamilton. A month later, it was reported that one Miss Sinclair was training local children to put on a blackface act for the benefit of the Carnegie Library in town. The local paper remarked, quote, 14 little people in blackface and gaudy costumes will complete the circle, and the work of the little fun makers promises to be remarkable, end quote. The coverage also mentioned that Miss Sinclair had just successfully completed a similar show in Cheyenne. Several purely professional acts toured Laramie too. In 1908, Harry Holman, a blackface comedian also known as the Man in Red, played the electric. The Laramie Boomerang reported, quote, he never fails to bring down the house, end quote. Both amateur and professional blackface performances included women and children. For instance, blackface performers Harry Ward and Miss Nettie Wilson played the Lyric Theater in 1910. The Deloys, a family of actors, were, quote, a great hit, end quote, when they put on a blackface skit. Likewise, in Sheridan in 1911, the Star Theater featured the Inslee brothers for 10 cents a ticket. The brothers were, quote, the world's famous juvenile comedians, and Byron, the younger of the two, does a blackface and is certainly a riot. He is only 12 years of age, and the youngest performer on the stage in the world today doing blackface, end quote. After a similar act played the Empress, the local newspaper coverage revealed that the animal reel-to-reels played after the live show delighted the many children in the audience. So not only were there women and children on stage, but they were in the audiences as well. Blackface shows often included what was portrayed as authentic African American music and dancing. In January 1922, a recent blackface performance received glowing reviews in the Casper Herald. The article read, quote, "Although a young man, he was a favorite with the audience, his jig was good," end quote. The Lyric Theater, also in Casper, hosted a vaudeville show in February of 1922. The ad enticed readers to, quote, "hear that funny blackface monologue," end quote. Audiences could see the performers along with several other acts, including Skinny Lamont, who was 6 feet 7 inches and called the Dancing Clothespin. In June, a vaudeville show at the Iris included blackface singing, talking, and dancing by Dixie Boy Morris, quote, "a sun-kissed boy from Dixie," end quote. And this kind of entertainment was not just popular in the larger towns of Wyoming. Small towns received their share of such amusements. In 1904, the Evanston Opera House featured McIntyre and Heath, quote, "those princes of blackface entertainers," end quote. In 1910 and 1912, blackface comedians entertained audiences in Thermopolis, Rawlins, Guernsey, while Rock Springs, Lander, and Jackson Hole enjoyed such performances as well. In 1914, Lander was entertained with, quote, "the cotton fields before the war, the tinkling of banjos, the tender, simple ballads, the shuffling dances, and quaint humor," end quote. At the show, audiences would see an opening scene with, quote, "darkies at work in a field of cotton, enlivening toll with songs, dances, and sallies of quaint wit," end quote. These fictional renditions of slave life sublimated the horrifying reality of life in bondage and portrayed black peoples as demeaning stereotypes. The use of blackface to enhance local communities complicates the issue. In some cases, blackface performances raise money for various causes. I previously mentioned that shows benefited local business organization and the Red Cross, and there are other examples as well. For instance, in 1915, the small town of Hudson hosted, quote, "school entertainment," end quote, with blackface acts in order to raise money for a piano. The town of Lusk featured Al Johnson's blackface comedians in, quote, "the greatest minstrel show on earth," end quote, as part of the first annual carnival in 1919. The affair was held in order to buy a Victrola for local schools. The popularity of blackface performances persisted in Wyoming until at least the late 1940s. In 1944, at Fort Warren, Wyoming, the United Service Organizations, or the USO, put on a show for military personnel. One headlining act was Moran and Sadler, or the Two Black Crows. Moran was by this time a longtime veteran of blackface performing as part of the well-known duo Moran and Mac. In 1949, again at Fort Warren, blackface was part of a vaudeville show that included accordion and whistling acts. Jack Reach gave, quote, "an outstanding performance," end quote, claimed the local paper. Blackface spread dehumanizing stereotypes and anti-black ideology even in areas with little to no black population. Perhaps the low population of blacks living in Wyoming was one of the reasons blackface seemed to remain popular there for several decades longer than in other regions. Furthermore, the popularity of such entertainment suggests that Wyoming, like the American West in general, was not always a haven free from discrimination. The community of Empire sought to be self-sufficient, but it was also dependent on economic and social ties to other communities. On November 26, 1914, the Torrington Telegram published an editorial written by Empire resident Russell Taylor, titled, quote, "Empire Feels the Smart," end quote. Taylor focused on the poor treatment of blacks in communities surrounding Empire, especially the refusal of lodging and other public services. Russell Taylor wrote, quote, "With much pleasure, we have noticed the statement in your valuable paper that you publish the news of all the people. We believe that the public ought to know the inconvenience that our people are sometimes made to suffer for the simplest public accommodations in our county seat. We believe that such treatment is not approved by the best element in Torrington. The special occasion on which we would speak at present is the refusal of a lodging place for our school teacher during her attendance upon the County Teachers Institute, on the account of which refusal she was forced to go back and forth each day, thus working upon her considerable hardship to say the least. Now this is not the first time we have had to suffer such, but we have refrained from speaking out of it out of diffidence. But we now think that the public should know the circumstances that knowing it might correct the same. For we believe that the good people of Torrington and vicinity believe too much in fair play to tolerate such wrongs. We are as proud of our county seat as any other people, and we do not desire to see anything that will lessen her standing allowed to exist therein. Shall we have relief? Respectfully, Russell Taylor." Perhaps indicative of the challenges facing civil rights activists like Russell Taylor, a large ad of Taylor's editorial includes a racial slur. Black Wyomingites would not be afforded equal protection under the law for another 40 years. The Wyoming legislature did not pass a law providing equal access to public accommodations until 1957, when Governor Millward Simpson was able to get a law passed after several years of efforts. So the following contains graphic accounts of violence, and I wanted to take a moment for anyone who may prefer to leave for this portion of the presentation. In the United States, the lynching of blacks is usually associated with the South, but such brutal violence appears in the historical record of the American West, too. Historian Todd Gunther has examined the history of lynching in Wyoming. Specifically, he contends that, quote, "Wyoming, in fact, had a lynch rate more than 30 times higher than supposedly lynch-prone scares in the Deep South. Wyoming mobs, unlike their southern counterparts, which depended on a large, well-controlled black labor pool, dreamed of more than just making examples of alleged black miscreants. So few African Americans lived in Wyoming and were such an insignificant part of the statewide economy that mobbers saw a possibility of banishing them entirely and creating an all-white society," end quote. The lynching of blacks in Wyoming goes back to at least the mid-1800s. In 1864, just 1 year prior to the passage of the 13th Amendment, which would abolish slavery, a slave named Asa was the victim of mob violence at Fort Halleck, which is near what is now Elk Mountain, Wyoming. He was reported to have been beaten, tarred and feathered, skinned alive, and then dissected by the fort surgeon, who was also his owner, and left on the plains exposed to the elements and animal predation. His skin was then grotesquely displayed on the side of the fort's hospital. Those who came to live their frontier dreams in empire were not untouched by violence, like lynching and police brutality. Baseman Taylor, one of the first people to settle in empire, was murdered by the local county sheriff, his deputy, and a white prisoner in 1913. The sheriff who helped lynch Taylor is a figure that is still celebrated in Wyoming today, and his picture currently hangs in a place of honor at the Goshen County Courthouse. Empire resident Baseman Taylor had reportedly been acting erratically. He was arrested for vandalism and declared insane and hastily ordered to be committed to the state mental hospital in Evanston, Wyoming. He was detained at the Torrington Hotel as the town's jail was still under construction at the time. However, Taylor was killed before he could be taken to Evanston. Baseman Taylor was repeatedly beaten and strangled by the sheriff and his deputy in front of several witnesses. The sheriff also allowed another prisoner, an alleged horse thief, to guard Taylor while armed and unsupervised. The prisoner later admitted to assaulting Baseman Taylor in a sworn statement. Baseman Taylor's brother, Russell Taylor, filed a wrongful death suit against the sheriff and his insurance company. The two white men who were staying at the hotel while Baseman Taylor was being held there testified on behalf of the Taylor family. The two men reported seeing both the sheriff and one of his deputies violently strangle Taylor to the point he could no longer speak and had trouble breathing. Taylor would be restrained to a hotel bed and repeatedly beaten over the next few days until he was dead. In January of 1914, Russell Taylor was appointed administrator to Baseman Taylor's estate. The Torrington Telegram noted that Baseman Taylor, quote, died before being taken to the state hospital in Evanston, end quote. There was no mention of his murder or those responsible for it. The Goshen County Journal reported on April 23rd, 1914, that a judge had dismissed Russell Taylor's wrongful death suit against Sheriff Hayes and the U.S. Fidelity, with Taylor ordered to pay the court costs. Just a few years after the lynching of his brother, Russell Taylor and his family would follow the Species back to Nebraska. Just as moving to Wyoming failed to offer a permanent respite from racism, moving on from empire would fail to provide an escape from bigotry as well. Back in Nebraska and working in Scotts Bluff in 1919, Russell Taylor would again come face to face with local racism and white paranoia. Shortly after the lynching of a black man in Omaha resulted in a riot, the home of an African American family was mobbed by whites in Scotts Bluff when rumors spread that Russell Taylor was going to set up a boarding house for African Americans. These rumors proved to be unfounded. However, Taylor was very lucky because this was during the Red Summer of 1919, where thousands of blacks were hanged, shot, and burned at the stake by white supremacists in 36 cities around the United States. In 1920, the Empire Post Office officially closed, punctuating the disintegration of the community. Today, it is just windswept prairie. In closing, I'd like to again return to the words of James Baldwin. Quote, "The American soil is full of the corpses of my ancestors through 400 years and at least 3 wars. Why is my freedom, citizenship in question now? What one begs the American people to do for all our sakes is simply to accept our history." End quote. Thank you. So I think we have some time for questions.